Okay, welcome. It's 12 noon. So my name is Marcia Meskimen. I'm the director of the Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm sorry to be online and not in the room today. I would very much like to have been in the room for this talk, and especially. But if you are also joining online, let me give you a few small bits of housekeeping. There is a chat function and also a Q&A function on the webinar, and they will be monitored throughout so that there can be conversation brought into the discussion at the end if you are coming that way. And so do not worry about being able to feed into what I'm sure is going to end up being a very, very lively discussion today. So please just feel free to do that. I will be tuning out in a moment on the side, but I will be listening and keeping track of what's happening in the Zoom space, and we'll be able to feed those conversations in. So please do not be alarmed by that. So welcome, whether you are joining us online or if you are joining us at International House. And I'm very jealous if you were joining us at International House. It's a lovely day, and I'm sure you're going to have an incredibly lively and interesting discussion there as well. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Caroline Ritter as an Institute of Advanced Studies visiting fellow who's joining us from Texas State University. She's an historian of British history, and particularly cultural institutions and imperialism, which is an incredibly interesting area for really rethinking sort of vernacular histories of cultural imperialism. And I think that's going to be a very dynamic and exciting topic today. I'm going to be turning over very shortly to my colleague Marcus Collins, who comes from my school, Social Sciences and Humanities. But it's also really interesting to welcome a number of colleagues today, and I'm sure that this group is going to be convening in some ways around the IAS. We have a few visiting fellows over the course of the next few months who are working in very similar areas, and people are really beginning to establish a very exciting potential for thinking about imperial histories, cultural institutions, the significance of both China and Africa to these histories and to rethinking these histories and to rethinking the notion of Britishness, I think, as well. So I think this is very exciting, and I was delighted to see Poppy there, Toralf, Peter, and I'm sure the dynamics will continue throughout the conversation. At this point, welcome to all, and I'd like to turn over to Marcus to do a more specific introduction of today's seminar. Thank you.
Many thanks, Marcia. So yes, my name is Marcus Collins, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Caroline Ritter of Texas State University. So Caroline, as Marcia alluded to, is a historian of modern imperial Britain, and she particularly works on issues of decolonization and culture, and the relations between Britain and Africa, both at the very end of empire and in the newly emerging independent states. The cultural relations between Britain and Africa were the subject of her first very fine book, published by the University of California Press and entitled Imperial Encore. Her second book is about the topic we will hear today, and so looking at English language teaching as a form of soft power. All of this is reason enough, more than reason enough, to be delighted to invite her here today. But our particular interest in being able to host her for a week is that a number of us historians at Loughborough have been looking at broadcasting and decolonization. And so Caroline has been having discussions this week with Poppy Cullen and Pete Yendall and Rakesh Ankit and Toralf Klein, and also Nicola Bishop and Julie Kay. And so we've had a really, really stimulating set of discussions, and I think we have a research project that will come out of this, which would be an added bonus to Caroline's visit. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Caroline.
Thank you. So thank you for those introductions, both Marcia and Marcus. And I want to begin by thanking Marcia and all of the individuals at the Institute of Advanced Studies who've had a part in my visit to Loughborough, which has thus far been an immensely successful visit. So thank you so much. And I do also want to express appreciation to my faculty hosts, Marcus, as well as Pete Yendel and Poppy Cullen, all members of the International Relations, Politics and History Department. And now that we have determined that we'll be turning this week's work into a bigger and longer term collaboration, this is only the start of a beautiful friendship. So to say. Finally, I want to thank all of you, both those here in person as well as on Zoom, for taking time today to listen and to participate in this seminar. What I'm going to be presenting on is still a somewhat new research direction for me, and that means that more than ever, I welcome any reactions and questions you may have, as they can really only help me as I kind of keep thinking through this and try to carry it forward. So start the timer to make sure I leave time for that question and discussion. So following the Second World War, Britain saw a large uptick in the numbers of foreigners who were traveling into Britain to cities and towns in order to learn English from English teachers and among English people. And as this demand grew over the 1950s, a range of schools, centers, programs, and courses all popped up to meet it. From the start, the breadth and diversity of the facilities that began to advertise themselves as English language schools for foreigners cannot be overemphasized, as a very short list of examples quickly proves. For instance, one new school was the Bell School of Languages in Cambridge, which opened to its first 50 students in 1955 and grew to 180 students in later years. The director of the Bell School had been on the staff at the University of Cambridge, and his approach to language learning emphasized the importance of a peaceful setting and comfortable environment so that students could focus. Correspondingly, the Bell School occupied what had once been a private home on 5 acres of gardens just outside the city center. Students did not reside on the site, but the school took care to match them with nearby middle-class families, thus giving students a taste of regular English family life. In real contrast, around the same time in 1951, the Language Tuition Center started out of a 5-story building on Oxford Street in London. And 6 years later, the London Tuition Center is boasting that it taught 4,000 foreign visitors each year, spread across courses that range from 4 weeks in length to 12 months. A typical course at this school would contain 5 hours of daily instruction. Students had the option to add in extra sessions, but instead most students chose to spend their extra time sightseeing or shopping in London. For accommodations, the Language Tuition Center did not match students, but it did provide them with a list of possible host families whom they could pay separately if they wanted to rent a bedroom or have meals. Then there's another model. After being in operation for a few years, the Language Tuition Center opened an entirely different type of school with something called the Ladies' College of English on the southern coast of England. The Ladies' College presented itself as more of a finishing school than as a language school, and its 1- and 2-year curricula included secretarial skills, dancing, horse riding, and tennis, all in addition to English language courses. So I'm providing this kind of overview of some of the new schools and programs that were opening in the 1950s, just to give a sample of all that was beginning to advertise themselves to foreign visitors in this era. These sound like very kind of a little bit eccentric, some humble beginnings, but it marks the start of what's going to develop within half a century into a billion-pound industry within Britain, and one that had no sign of slowing down all the way to this day. Even the global pandemic could not slow down this sector. So this is a sector that developed entirely, like I said, over the past 75 years, from a handful of schools at the end of the Second World War to perhaps 800 or more such schools and programs at present. And later in this, I'll talk a little bit more about why that number is such a question mark. For much of my time with you all today, I'm going to trace the patterns by which the commercial language sector grew, but I'm going to be paying particular attention to when and how it attracted the attention of the UK state. Before I get into that, though, I want to pause and just take a minute to kind of explain a few of the elements that are at the center of this topic. The first of which is the English language. So in this history that I'm telling, the English language is a commodity or a product. The sector that I'm going to be describing, it grows exponentially, all because school proprietors sensed that there was a demand to learn English, a demand that comes from all over the world, and that consumers of this product will be willing to pay sometimes great amounts of money in order to get this commodity or acquire skills of the English language. I want to point out that that demand does not come out of nowhere. English language instruction is embedded in British imperialism. It really has been from the start, both directly in terms of being a component of the civilizing mission of colonial development projects, of post-colonial aid, but also just structurally, wherein language intersects with class, race, ethnic and national identity, and gender in underpinning and bolstering hierarchies of power. Then coupled with this, once you get in the middle of the 20th century, against the backdrop of the Cold War, you have the superpower, the United States, proactively billing English as a language of freedom. And then, of course, all of that is added to the ongoing process of globalization. What all of this is to say is that there were a huge number of factors that were pushing overseas individuals to seek out instruction in the English language. However, whatever the reason, when they chose to travel to Britain to learn English, they were consuming something that was being sold to them. There's much more I could say here too, in terms of how British officials and other individuals inside the UK spoke about the English language. As British officials grappled with Britain's declining geopolitical power over the second half of the 20th century, they start to pin more and more hopes on the English language, while at the same time kind of separating that language's history or isolating that history from kind of what it offered in terms of business opportunity. There starts to become a tendency to describe English as basically as Britain's golden goose that laid golden eggs. And for some, this generated or kind of resonated with a strong nationalistic vibe, and that can also, must not get lost when we describe the contributing role that English plays in Britain's global relationships. Second, and more briefly, I want to point out that this particular topic that I'll be discussing also overlaps with a more commonly studied history, which is the history of overseas students inside the UK, but really meaning overseas students at British universities. In one way, the population of overseas or foreign students who I'll be describing, who are customers of commercial language schools, are distinctly separate from the presence of overseas students at universities. And that's because the students I'll be describing come into Britain to learn something that is not taking the place of any domestic students. So there's no discussion of there's only so many spots at a university, should it go to foreign students or should it go to more domestic students? Instead, when you're looking at commercial language schools, their kind of consumer base is solely those who don't know English. On the other hand, when I describe the increasing skepticism that starts to be displayed, particularly in policy circles, as well as among the public, towards overseas students, including their true intentions with regard to the British welfare state, British visa and immigration policy, and so on. Both students taking courses at commercial language schools for a month or two, and students doing a full-time, full-length program at a university, those are all getting grouped together as an overseas student population that needs to be kind of governed over, controlled, regulated, and so on. And that's going to become important in the later period that I discuss. All right, so all those asides taken care of, I've put up the brief outline of what I'll be kind of moving through in the history of the growth of the commercial language school sector. And you can see from this, I'll really be focusing on how the sector comes to be viewed by the British state. The first part is I will be returning to the discussion of the appearance of language schools for foreign students, particularly in the decades right after the Second World War. Okay, so I gave you an overview of some of the schools that appeared in the 1950s. By 1960, one estimate put the number of commercial language programs in the UK at more than 60. They were not spread evenly throughout the country. For example, about 15 of those 60 were in Cambridge alone, and another 10 were in Oxford. And the reason for these concentrations was largely because proprietors sought to be positively associated with the Cambridge or Oxford brand name, in which they assumed many overseas individuals would recognize. And this stays true, by the way, all the way into the 21st century. There's a point in the early 2000s when a cabinet minister remarked cynically, oh, if only every school that had Oxford in its name was actually to be found in Oxford, as kind of a comment about that tendency. The other notable cluster of schools in 1960 was in London, where proprietors assumed, the metropolis offered extra appeal to foreign visitors. But 60 is a lot, given that it's been less than a decade since the kind of commercial sort of sector has started to take off in this area. And that so many and such similar businesses were appearing in such short succession reflects both the confidence in the growing industry and that the marketplace of providers was already starting to get a little crowded. Therefore, each school sought ways to distinguish itself from others and to ensure an endless stream of fee-paying enrollees. Over especially the 1960s, you see when you look at the marketing materials these schools were creating, ways that this market was really diversifying. So for example, if a school was pretty small or in a small kind of house of sorts, it might have its promotional materials talk a lot about the family-like atmosphere and culture at the school, compared to schools that have larger student bodies at different levels that would talk a lot about how a person was much more likely to become fluent in English if they were practicing with a really diverse group of other students. There's also curricular differences that schools try to promote. So some schools are full-time only, others have part-time options. Others introduce the idea of a vacation course, which would basically be a summer course with more emphasis on taking class on the road through excursions to various sites. And then a final way that there starts to be separation within various schools is evident in the parts of the world that they really focus their kind of advertising towards. This is true even in the early period when schools didn't actively advertise so much as they relied on word of mouth and reputation. But as you get into the 1970s, 1980s, when they're really upping their kind of marketing, advertising budgets, you start to see focus on certain areas of the world. And I have a quote from a director of a school in Bournemouth showing when he sort of identified, okay, China is the kind of next market. And I should also mention, I had briefly talked about the 3 locations, Oxford, Cambridge, and London. By the 60s, the coast, Bournemouth and Brighton and places like that, has really become the next real concentration, especially for those summer courses. So you can see an example, the attractive forces of that here. All right, so let's talk about how all of this is received by the British state. Remember, these are private enterprises that are aimed at visitors who are over the compulsory school age. And while some courses appear to fall into the category of further education, many others were too short in length or were not oriented enough towards skills-based learning. Altogether, there was no obvious reason that the various schools of English and language courses would fall under the Ministry of Education's purview for inspection or regulation. As rapidly as Britain's commercial language sector was growing during these decades, and as significant as it was becoming for the national economy on the whole, and on particular local economies, all of this is existing largely outside direct attention or oversight from the state. When politicians and intellectuals did comment on the new industry, they would do it in the kind of framework of cultural diplomacy. They would really applaud the power of Britain's national language to forge international understanding and cultural ties. Whether speaking about politicians, local authorities, school principals, and the like, they all talked positively about how these schools provided foreign visitors with a very personalized and positive impression of Britain that they would then carry back to their home countries and would have with them throughout their lives. Saying kind of that personal one-on-one interaction, it was everything. Though less often said out loud, but perhaps much more important, were the economic effects of this cultural diplomacy. Not only did the foreign visitors come into post-war Britain and spend money, but they would then continue to have an association with British products and services in years to come, all facilitated by the newly obtained knowledge of the English language. If there was any shadow cast on the cultural diplomacy that English language schools could achieve, it came as the result of market diversification. And to give an instance of this, I'm going to describe just one school, and a moment in 1959 when officials inside the Ministry of Education learned of a new operation that's opened in Ramsgate in Kent called the Regency Tuition Center. So this is a school that's opening in what had been a resort hotel, but the resort hotel is still in operation. It's basically saying, okay, this portion, this hallway, these rooms, that's going to be where the School of English is. As you can see from the school's glossy prospectus, it really took advantage of that, pictures of the hotel, the resort as a whole, and then the text would talk a lot about how students could, in addition to their English lessons, they could take advantage of the other resort offerings. They could play golf, they could practice driving, they could play tennis, and so on. This was to the proprietor behind this operation. This was his kind of corner of the market. This was going to be kind of, you know, what made this school different. But when the Ministry of Education first learned of it, their officials were a little more skeptical. They were kind of pretty worried about this business. And that's particularly true when then the British Council learns about this school. So basically the Ministry of Education was like, we don't love this, but we need to kind of let it do its thing. It's just one more example. The British Council, on the other hand, is pretty alarmed. And you can see that from the quote I put up here, where you have a British Council official saying that he had heard of one case of a student who practiced English at the bar to the detriment of his pocket. And then in a quote that I wish I could spend so much more time talking about, he said, I'm not suggesting this sort of thing is itself harmful, but I do not think we can recommend people like Italian girl students to go to a school with this type of background. It's just a snapshot, but it shows how kind of really with its origins, the English language school industry is already starting to attract a little bit of scrutiny. And that carries into Parliament. By 1960, you have members of Parliament, such as Labour MP Christopher Mayhew, who are raising the issue of these schools and really saying, well, some of them are creating bad impressions of Britain. He read out loud in the comments, he read out loud letters he received from foreigners about schools that unashamedly took advantage of those students through false advertising and exorbitant tuition for no educational return. You can see some of the quotes out here, calling it, examples of crookery, saying their school had no heat, and then Christopher Mayhew starts to refer to them as narcovers and chiselburys. Mayhew's point was to say that actually letting this industry grow unregulated was going to tarnish the otherwise excellent reputation that British education held overseas. So kind of to summarize where we are at this point, after this kind of origin period, the first stage of growth, is that after the Second World War, institutions to teach English to foreign visitors proliferated as part of Britain's effort to sustain influence with foreign elites and as part of an overall cultural diplomacy campaign. The emergence of the English language industry inside post-war Britain, therefore, was compatible with British foreign and domestic policy on several levels. The fact that the English language is at the core served nationalistic interests and reinforced cultural ties between the parts of the former empire, while the promotion of the language as being inclusive and empowering aligned with American Cold War rhetoric. Even more, the language fostered individuals' mobility across borders and, as kind of proponents would proclaim frequently, fostered greater liberalization of markets and borders. Really importantly, though, all of this is happening with no investment from the state. The direct financial risk appeared to be minimal, because these schools are private enterprises, and they could just kind of let it happen and then kind of reap the benefits. There was that little bit of kind of concern that we sort of saw in terms of, well, what about the bad schools? What about the sketchy schools and so on? that was ultimately kind of pacified with explanations that the marketplace would ultimately determine the fate of both good and bad schools. In other words, although there was a little concern that an unregulated language school would remain a liability, it was a liability the British state was willing to allow. So for the next part of this talk, I'm going to turn my attention to considering the ways that these students who are coming into Britain in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, to enroll part-time or for a short term in commercial schools, how they fit within British immigration law of the time. So going back to that early period, language school proprietors never contemplated that any of their prospective students might run into issue entering the United Kingdom. The way it worked in the 50s and early 60s was that when a prospective student applied and was admitted and sent in his or her deposit, the school would send back a letter of acceptance, and then as far as the school was concerned, that would answer any questions that might arise. In fact, that was really largely true. Their students' experiences of the port of entry or the checks that they had the correct paperwork were incredibly brief, barely over a minute. And that's because immigration officers largely granted a huge degree of trust to anyone who, in the minds of the immigration officer, could reasonably belong in the category of student. Well, who are we talking about at this time? Keep in mind that the first generation of language schools that are truly successful in getting students to come are doing so through the high caliber of their name and connections. They also had requirements that students enrolling in their programs needed to prove they had a year of formal English language learning already in order to be accepted. And also remember that in the 1950s, there's huge barriers to foreign travel, plus of course, the cost of tuition, room and board. All of this is to say that when language schools first pepper Southern England, there's an assumption, kind of just overall assumption, that the students of English that they would be bringing in were visitors that Britain wanted. Thus, the apparatus of immigration law and border controls didn't really contain limitations on who qualified as a student. So that would hold during the 1960s. Despite the fact that the 1960s are a time when almost all other areas of British immigration law were getting fiercely scrutinized as being in need of legislative attention. So I put on the slide here a list of the major British legislation concerning immigration. Don't worry, I'm not going to turn this into a full-blown lecture on British immigration law. I do want to say that this is something that a number of historians have paid a good deal of attention towards, and in so doing have produced great scholarship, both pointing out and focusing on the undeniably racist framework that became enacted in statutory law. However, if we were to go through this list of legislation while asking how it might affect potential English language learners, there is not a clear answer or clear pattern. That's really in part because the population of potential language students, it crosses with other categories. So for example, those coming after 1972, those coming from parts of Europe had one type of entry, while those coming from other parts of Europe had a different type of entry. There's the point that the determination between a Commonwealth migrant and an alien is changing over this time period, and who knows English and who doesn't map clearly onto those categories. I would also point out that all throughout this period, market diversification is within the language school sector is really catering to changes in immigration law. So remember, the schools are trying to find their consumer base and are orienting themselves towards it. And so when something happens, like Britain joins Europe, then the schools are like, oh, that really eases in, Western Europeans all the more, let's focus even more marketing there. Or when, for example, Pakistan leaves the Commonwealth, and so the immigration law changes what Pakistanis could enter Britain under, some of the schools that have been really focusing on South Asian students sort of try to talk about how they're going to adjust as a result. This is, though, what's happening at the kind of top line level of British immigration legislation. And just because there's not a whole lot of change to the legislative requirements concerning entry as a student at this level, it doesn't mean that individuals, British officials who were involved in crafting and enforcing immigration and visa policies during the 1960s and 1970s were not thinking about students. In fact, some were acutely concerned about students. For example, you have the head of immigration saying, it's really not easy to define a student, and he starts to become preoccupied with this. How could he come up with a concrete, loophole-free definition of a student? That same year, a meeting of the Overseas Students Committee writes that, well, if we're not going to really require any evidence to be a student, then it'll be not long before any migrant into Britain is calling themselves a student. And a decade later, you have another Home Office official talking about what in his mind had become alarming, which was the kind of bad apples, essentially, those who would pretend to study when actually they wanted to obtain settlement or were seeking to work, or in his words, in other ways, abusing our hospitality. As you might notice, the Ministry of Government that is pivotal here, and the Ministry of Government I'll be talking about from now on, it's not the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in charge of international relations, nor is it the Department of Education in charge of education, nor even is it the British Council. Instead, it's the Home Office, the Law and Order Ministry, those responsible for policing and security. And I think that shift is really significant, that the kind of marketplace and developments within the language school kind of sector is now, or when it gets the attention of the British state, it gets the attention of the Home Office. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Ministry of Department of Education, they were willing to kind of let it go, but it's the Home Office that's suddenly getting involved. So at the level of legislation that Parliament would vote on throughout these decades, like I mentioned before, there were not many changes to what criteria one had to meet in order to be deemed a student. Nor were there many limitations on student visas, nor were there many changes to the limitations on student visas. But when you look below that level, inside the Home Office hallways, there's enormous activity in these decades. And that activity is taking place through a mechanism called the immigration rules, which are the 100+ page document that explain the precise administrative process by which someone may and may not be granted a visa. These rules are constantly revised throughout the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, really to the present, to be honest. And Home Office officials felt empowered when they revised them. In fact, there's a moment in the early 1980s when one woman who was responsible for overseeing a comprehensive review of the immigration rules directly reminded her colleagues that review could often lead to new rules, so they should see this as an opportunity. In addition, it really corresponds with some recent scholarship on the 1970s that suggests that decade was a pivotal moment when the Home Office acquired a great deal more executive power, and I think the immigration rules really stand as a clear example or illustration of it. I should also say the immigration rules, as I alluded to before, are critical even today. So when you read a news story about, say, how the current conservative government is making changes to the financial resources that a person needs to demonstrate to enter Britain, or whether those working in care industries can bring dependents or not, those are all taking place through the immigration rules, not through legislation voted on by Parliament. I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but I want to point to one instance that first looks at the policy solutions that Home Office officials were debating between or kind of considering, but also how English language study was really central in their minds, but also really complicated the options they were considering. So I took out a quote, it's from that same guy, T. Fitzgerald, in 1973, where he was sort of spelling through what he saw as possible changes. But I want to highlight the sort of levers that he saw how the student visa could kind of be tightened. In other words, you don't have to read all the text, you can just think about the kind of categories of change that he was considering. Overshadowing all of his comments really is this question of how common or how many bad actors there were, how many individuals were posing as students when they had other intentions. And this is something where the speculation, for a little while I tried to chart all the different possible numbers that Home Office officials would throw out. It was all math. But they're never really sure if they're talking about a really common problem or a really rare problem, nor are they, the same comes to schools. They would speculate, well, there's only 100 English language schools. Oh no, there's 2,000 English language schools. They really are all over the map, part of because they have never regulated the industry up until this point, thus leaving it really open to speculation. But the Home Office, or these officials, they are really looking at a lot of possible options. One, they could limit the total amount of time that someone could be a student, could have a student visa. As you can kind of see in this particular example, though, he mentioned, well, there's this student from Iran who took 8 years to obtain his O level in English. However, the lobby of English language schools would point out, well, English is not something you can just get in a 6-month course. It's actually incredibly difficult to start from zero and get to the point of being able to pass O levels in the English language. It needs to take you need to have a really long time. So then another possibility the Home Office considers is to institute a no switching policy. And this is something that's frequently brought up as a sort of way to tighten the rules governing student visas, saying basically you can't come in on one program and then switch to another and switch to another. Again, they saw English and English language learning as a real problem because before you could come in on a course on, what did he give us as an example, aeronautical engineering, you presumably might need to bolster your language skills. And so if they had the no switching policy, they might be hurting one or more sectors of further education or higher education that were now increasingly relying on foreign students. Then there's the matter of full-time or part-time. The Home Office is constantly saying, well, to be a full-time student, you should be studying 40 hours a week in class, to which the English language schools would respond, no, full-time study is 15 hours, then you should go out and practice. Speak to all the English speakers that you might meet on the street or wherever, and they thought that that was considered part of the full-time, to the detriment of efforts to require more than 15 hours a week of class time. Then last, there's the matter of work. This man doesn't speak about it, but kind of a constant overview is whether to allow students coming in to earn money to work. This is one of the instances where the presence of foreign students of any sort and their relationship with the welfare state is constantly debated. Britain is committed to full employment at the time, so if they allowed language students to work, they might be taking jobs away from British citizens. However, there were many areas of the economy as a whole that really actually relied on those who would take low-paying jobs. So all of this is to say, because I want to move on, that the impetus to restrict that is coming out of the Home Office, it does have an effect. It has an effect through the immigration rules, and it has an effect of creating a culture of skepticism around the student visa. So overall, these administrative changes, the policies through which immigration law were implemented and enforced, the back and forth, all the discussion about we could do this, we could do this, we could do this. Although it starts with skepticism within one particular ministry of government, it's then going to spill into more and more ministries and then the public as a whole. And one of the big facilitators of that spillage, especially when you get to the next era I'll look at, the 1990s and beyond, is the media, the press. So the final part of my discussion, I'm going to examine the balance. From the state's perspective, the balance of attention and resources that we see going towards attracting one group of international students while trying to deter or deport another group. But I'm also going to be using a lot of examples of reporting coming through the media that is adding to this issue amongst the public. And I'll start by introducing some terms that started to be deployed frequently in the 90s. That's the term visa factory, along with the terms sham or bogus school. By the mid-1990s, the discussions taking place earlier within the Home Office have reached the mainstream press. And stories about, and there were so-called students, are becoming kind of more and more commonplace. It's also even become a subject that newspapers, such as the London Times in this instance, are actually devoting investigative resources. And this is an example of one such investigation, when the London Times published an expose in which it claimed to have uncovered fraud among language schools that were helping foreigners pose as students in order to gain entry into Britain. You can see that in the title. Visas sold by schools is the headline on page 1, with a continuing headline that visa factories were offering a shortcut to the job market. And there's a whole, this goes on for many pages, a series, and then had follow-up articles as well, where a Times reporter posed as a international visitor who really wanted to stay in Britain and found a school that said, well, if you want to actually attend class, it's this much, but if you just want to pay us and we'll call you a student, it'll be this much, and so on. And you start to see it in pages. Also, I should say it's hard to see, but the flyer talking about full-time English courses, at the bottom it has that line, student visas will be arranged. And this type of news reporting would say that's proof that the school was willing to basically lie to help you get into the UK. So, foreigners and school proprietors using loopholes in the student visa process to evade controls. Isn't this exactly what those Home Office officials had both anticipated and tried to head off earlier? So how is this still happening? Why hadn't the immigration rule tightening taken care of this? In part, the answer is, as much as officials inside the Home Office might have wanted to close loopholes, their arguments actually were running against other imperatives of those in government. Another way to say this is that outside the Home Office, there were many others in British government who saw real value in easing or even aiding international student migration into Britain. So on the cusp of a new century, the new Labour government latched onto the overseas student marketplace as an area where Britain had competitive advantage. Prime Minister Tony Blair announced an initiative in 1999 that he said would attract more international students to the United Kingdom. And he was not just talking, he was very explicit about university students. Instead, Blair identified further education institutions and other kind of part-time educational learning as really the area where there could be the most growth that he was projecting. So in many ways, it would appear that New Labour's approach towards internationalized education was to reinforce and extend even more the marketizing trends that have been central to the commercial school industry from its start. When Blair introduces this policy, he frames it as part of his government's multifaceted and sophisticated approach to globalization in all its forms. And he said that it couldn't just be a change to, how many international students were accepted, but they needed to think of all aspects of the visa system, including relaxing limitations on work while someone was on a course. And indeed, one thing that Blair's government does in the early 2000s is it opens up the hours that anybody under student visa could work up to. They could work up to 20 hours per week, no matter what type of course or program they were on. That's a lot of information about that, what I just summarized. But as we've seen already, when we looked at just the commercial language schools, those schools were a marketplace that had already demonstrated a real ability to contort itself to the legislative framework in order to kind of maintain and even enhance its standing within that marketplace. And in the early 2000s, that happens yet again. Again, you don't have to read this text, but basically the schools say, okay, now if somebody can work 20 hours, great, we will help help kind of ease that as long as we continue to have students coming in and enrolling in our programs. This is from an Irish school, but Ireland had the same policies at this time. This is a quote from a teacher saying, yeah, they're just in my classroom so they check the box, but actually all my students are really just here to work. And the English language schools are kind of taking the lead in terms of schools advertising themselves as, look, Britain has these new policies, here's how you can make this work for you, come to Britain, we will help you. So by this point, there's no question that the fact the language school marketplace has contorted itself in response to new policies set by the government is a way that the language school kind of is providing itself slippery for the government to really try to achieve its overall aims. So by this point, there's no question that another set of politics and policy considerations, those of migration and border control, have now become embedded with how the state is viewing the language school industry, as well as how the language school industry is continuing to contort itself to the facets of the market. That relationship, as I'm starting to allude to, and that I want to look more carefully at in more research, it's not a simple one. When the state debates possible solutions to known loopholes or ways trying to close down, ways of evading British immigration control, it immediately finds itself in a discussion of trade-offs. Right when Blair's government was easing certain limitations on students, it was also devoting resources towards catching or shutting down bogus or sham institutions. So we see that a few years later when Home Office officials say that they have systematically checked 672 colleges in London, of which they found only 178 to be genuine. They deemed that 195 were absolutely bogus, barely existed at all, and another 299 needed much more investigation. And I should say the Home Office had been doing such investigations, devoting resources to visiting schools, trying to say, we need to see your rosters and so on, in the early 2000s, but they really step up the attention that they're giving after the July 7th, 2005 attacks, when this becomes more and more kind of fueled by concern that language schools in particular, but any schools that are really attracting large numbers of visitors on a short-term basis, are kind of entryway to networks that are enabling threats to national security in the UK. The final thing I'll say on this before getting to my conclusions, this is not partisan. I could go to the 2010 Conservative Manifesto, where Cameron's party also attempts to walk that same line, saying we want to attract good apples while also saying there's a lot of bad apples out there who are threats to British society and security. And when the Conservative Party or the coalition government comes into power, they again try to walk that same line of saying international students come, but also devoting resources towards investigating what they deem to be bogus or sham schools. Okay, so in my time speaking to you all, what started off as a historical examination of the commercial language school sector in the framework of cultural diplomacy has now brought us into a full-throated discussion of Tory and Labour immigration approaches. I'm really interested in the pathways that brought us here. I think it's critically illustrated in showing how those old-fashioned views of a very personalized cultural diplomacy carried out by individuals through positive impressions of a nation's towns and hosts has evolved into a state apparatus focused in one hand on profitability, but in another hand on security. In the last minute before I turn to discussion and questions, I want to bring it back to some of the really central questions I see this raising for really trying to understand post-imperial Britain. The first I want to point out is the commercial language school sector is only one of many English language industries, whole areas of business and enterprise where the commodity of the English language is the center, is the kind of core product, whether speaking about testing organizations, whether speaking about publishing houses, promoting TEFL materials and so on. There's a lot of different areas and businesses that are really commodifying, commercializing English, and that together are then going to form a very powerful lobby, which is one of the things that policymakers start to have to contend with. Second, what I've been describing is actually only a small area in which TEFL is growing and appearing in the UK in these decades. And the experiences of the students I've been speaking about, the experiences of the teachers I've been speaking about are vastly different from the experiences that local education authorities were having as they were trying to strike a balance or kind of conform to having non-English speaking students in their primary and secondary classrooms. However, there's connecting threads, things like the training to be a teacher in the TEFL industry, so the master's or certification or whatever type of degree, that is also going to start to grow in the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s. Universities, technical colleges that are offering certification in teaching English as a foreign language. Some of them are geared towards the commercial language school sector. Others are geared towards teachers in local education authority schools. I also want to point out this is starting to touch on a subject that I'm sure is familiar to really anyone who works in higher education in the UK, in the US, elsewhere, which is the internationalization and commercialization taking place within institutions of higher education and further education. And then the last point to think about with all of this is the international competition Britain feels that it is facing here. International competition, not just from the United States and Australia, but increasingly from Ireland, then even from China, then even from Southeast Asia and India, as you know, TEFL is a growing industry in all those places as well, and they want to get in on the profits that Britain felt it deserved, essentially. After all, it was Britain's golden goose and golden egg. So this is where I'm going to stop here. I really welcome your questions, your reactions. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you.